And the cards played influence the ways the words can be coined. The phonology and the phoneme inventory and phonotactics available for the words to be coined. There's also a set of translation challenges, which are a set of cards with a sentence on each, which gives each player an individual goal. That I want to translate this sentence into the language. And there's also a common translation challenge placed face up for everyone to work on together. So it combines cooperative and competitive aspects. The cooperative aspect of creating the language together and working together to translate this common translation challenge goal. And the competitive aspect of being the first one to translate your own personal challenge that you're the only one who knows about it. This started many years ago, probably 15 years ago or so. My brother and I developed a free-form game with a similar structure. The players just take turns creating words, and there were no restrictions on the phonology or phonotactics, which meant in practice we tended to make up English-esque words, just imitate the phonology and phonotactics of English unreflectively. So a year or two ago, I started thinking about how I could take that game and make it more systematic, more linguistically interesting and valid. And I tried, briefly experimented with a board game idea where the square you would land on would tell you the kind of word you could make, for instance. But I didn't really go very far with that, wasn't really satisfied with it. And then later came up with the idea of a card game where you would have cards that represent phonemes and cards that represent syllable structures and some other cards that represent syntactic forms, possible word orders, for instance. So having thought about this for a little while, I posted to the Conway list about it and got some feedback on it back in January, and then started working on making up a deck of cards, which I was able to get people together and play test back in March of this year. I play tested with a group of intelligent gamers who weren't particularly linguistically sophisticated. Some of them had taken German or Spanish in high school or college, but other than that, didn't have much experience or knowledge about languages in general. And it went over pretty well with this group of people. There was some initial difficulty in explaining the rules and the terminology used in the game, terms like phoneme, for instance. But once the initial terminological difficulties were over, it went pretty well. The turn structure of the game, basically each player begins with a translation challenge card and 3 cards from the main deck, which could be syllables or phonemes or syntax specifiers or action cards that include sound changes and grammar changes and meaning changes. And then on each turn, a player will draw a card and play a card, which could influence the evolution of the language in some way. And then they coin a word. They would use the existing phonemes and syllables in play and say the word out loud, and then demonstrate to the other players what it means without using English, using charades or drawing pictures or pointing out examples in the environment. After with this first game, I had made the main deck, but I hadn't yet made up any translation challenge sentences. So I handed out some blank cards to the players and said, make up 2 or 3 sentences, about 4 to 5, 6 words long, and we'll throw them all together and shuffle them, and then draw one each and place one face up. So as you might guess, there was an excessive variation in the difficulty. One player drew, these are the times that try men's souls, and another, where's the restroom? So next, thing to do after that playtesting session was to make up a more balanced set of translation challenges. And some of the players had an interesting suggestion, which was to make 2 or 3 different sets of sentence parts that could be randomly put together to make a wider variety of sentences. So I made a subject deck and a predicate deck where all of the subjects are animate and would make sense with all of these predicates that could be applied to animate subjects. Is that better? Also made some other minor changes after that, or during or after that playtesting session. Increased the number of cards per hand from 3 to 4 to make the game move faster. Modified the content of the deck, increasing the proportion of syllable cards to phoneme cards so that play could get started earlier. And later someone had a suggestion of starting out the game by laying out some random phoneme and syllable cards so that we don't have to wait for several people to play cards before we can start making words. One possible issue is that the number of phoneme and syllable cards in play tends to grow without limit until perhaps the whole deck, all of the ones in the deck are used up. And it would probably be a good idea to have some rule for limiting the number of cards of each type at play at a given time. And then some additional way of increasing or decreasing the limit during play. But this is in initially short games. I think the first playtesting game we played, which lasted about 2 hours or so, had a phoneme inventory of about 14 or 15 phonemes at the end, although there had been others that were merged or dropped out in the course of the game. And the second playtesting session more recently had only 12 phonemes at the end. The winning sentence of that first playtesting game was "Śnisny żnuaz sad shini pada midani." You should offer more variety. More literally, you plural, options more should give. The subject, object, verb card was in play at the time. I was able to playtest again more recently on the 4th of July at a gaming party. With a small group of 4 people. In about 2 hours, we coined 18 words, and we ended on the translation of the Common Translation Challenge, working on it together, since we were running out of time and couldn't translate our individual challenges. And ended up with only 12 phonemes in play. So that was a little bit slower getting started. I had a little bit more difficulty teaching the rules to this group of players, but still, after a few rounds of examples and explaining specific application of the rules as we went along, it started moving faster. It was interesting to see. I explained to both groups of players you can demonstrate the meaning of your word with charades or drawing pictures or pointing out examples. But the first group of players almost all used charades for every word. I don't think we could do any pictures at all. And the second group used pictures, at least as the first resort, for almost everything, and sometimes resorted to charades when the pictures weren't clear. I have a hope or suspicion that Glossotechnia could be used for teaching certain aspects of linguistics, especially possibly historical linguistics, and the way languages change over time. But I would like to get more feedback on the content of the deck and the specific way that the sound change and grammar change cards work, to try to make them try to make the development of the language during play more plausible in terms of historical linguistics. So far, I can say that the game as it is now may be useful just for teaching the very basic aspects of phonology and phonotactics. This is a phoneme, these are the different kinds of phonemes, these are some of the possible syllable structures a language can have. and something about the way languages vary in their typology, the different ways that the constituents of a sentence can be ordered and so forth. I'm going to show slides about a few cards from the deck, samples of different kinds. Okay, we've got a couple of sample syllable cards here with the consonant, vowel, nasal, plosive, such as sant or kumb, for instance, and consonant vowel. The consonant vowel card probably occurs more often than any other syllable card in the deck. Basically, the simpler syllable structures occur several times each, and the more complex syllable structures occur only once each. The syntax cards include modifier head and head modifier, each occurring twice. And then the overall sentence structure, subject, verb, object, verb, subject, object, verb occurring twice each, and the word orders that have the object before the subject occurring once each. There are phoneme cards, which for the initial groups of players, the phonemes included all the phonemes of English, plus a handful of phonemes that most Americans will be familiar with from German or French or Spanish classes. And you notice each phoneme has a phonological description of it underneath the IPA symbol, which is needed for application of the sound change cards, where certain cards require you to match two phonemes on at least one feature. So that you could, for instance, turn one nasal consonant into another, or turn a consonant at one point of articulation into another at the same point of articulation with a different manner of articulation. And then there's also an English example of the way that phoneme is pronounced, or in some cases, a foreign language example with an approximate English example. There are various action cards. This one constrains another player, you specify, to create a word of a certain part of speech or in a certain semantic category. So you can determine what another player can do with their next turn. There are other action cards like loan word, which lets you borrow a word from another language rather than making one a priority. The other cards are meaning change, which is basically extend meaning and restrict meaning. If you all have any suggestions for other things you can do with meanings of words that could be more generalized into a card game mechanics, I'm open to that. Sound change includes sound shift, which simply substitutes one phoneme for another. Phoneme merge, where you take two phonemes that are already in play and send one to the discard pile, causing it to merge into the other phoneme. Phoneme split, similarly, you play down an additional phoneme card and say that in the existing words coined so far, this phoneme changes into that in certain contexts. The grammar change cards including adding an inflection or dropping an inflection, which basically leaves up to the player what kind of inflection to use, prefixing or suffixing or mutation. The tendency of the rules and the deck structure at present is to have the players make up an isolated language with very little inflection. And I'm been thinking about ways to change that so that there's more scope for a wider variety of languages to come out of these games. I've thought about having typology cards that specify the position of the language on a isolating inflectional polysynthetic scale. maybe an agglutinative card. When that's in play, anybody can make up an inflection on any turn, instead of, or as well as coining a new word. But, or a polysynthetic card, which would require you to incorporate your pronouns, object and subject pronouns, into the verb in some way, for instance. But I'm still working out the details of how to implement that. And I'm open to good suggestions about that. There might also be typology cards that determine the case structure of the language, whether it's nominative or ergative or active or whatever. And at present, all these type of decisions are left to the players to implement using the add inflection cards or just the way they structure their sentences, which possibly leaves a tendency to unreflectively imitate English. It's interesting that I think the tendency to create isolating languages, given these rules and this deck of cards, is interesting to the way that the Glossotechnia project worked out. In brief, Glossotechnia was a collaborative codelining effort that basically worked on a web script that let you add sentences to a corpus and vote up or down sentences so that the ones that got voted down enough would drop out. So at the beginning, there were just a few sentences in Glossotechnia and a few sentences which were their translations into English. And you could add more sentences with your own translation of your added sentences in English. There was no grammar specification, no dictionary definitions, just the words used in context to let you figure out what they meant. So different players had different ideas about what words meant, what these structures should actually be used for. But over time, it consistently developed as an isolated language with very slight inflection, which is pretty much the same way that these languages coming out of this card game have developed. This may be a general tendency to unstructured collaborative conlanging, which may be connected to the way pigeons and creoles form. There's remains some tendency to relax English in these games, both with the definition of the words and the sentence structures, in aspects where the cards don't explicitly forbid that. But the phonotactics of the language have been interesting. Even in the second game where I played, I gave the players only phonemes from English turned up in play. But still, given the syllable cards in play, the phonotactics turned out interestingly different from English. We had, for instance, lax vowels occurring in word final position. The winning sentence in that game was "Kill Nita of Tinat Litin Kong." How did the linguist's friend find us? Here's some of these subjects and predicates from the translation challenge deck. So one random subject and one random predicate drawn by each player, and one random card from each deck placed face up for all players to work on together. And in this case, it was the linguist's friend subject, and how did blank find us? There's a couple of more card types that I haven't used in a game yet, which we'll be using for the first time today. The phonemic contrast cards, which allow you to apply a certain type of contrast to all of the consonants or all of the vowels at once, or perhaps a certain subset of them. labialization, palatalization, nasalization, rounding, voicing, and the corresponding sound change card, which eliminates one of those contrasts that's in play. Here is the lexicon we worked up for the first playtesting game back in March. See, there were several non-English phonemes in play. N, and I think that's all that came up in that game. It's interesting, the players were able to pronounce N distinctly at the end of a word, but when it was combined with a fricative, as the first syllable card played in that game was fricative nasal plosive, and for a long time that was the only syllable card available. So we had several sni, 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 and then finally we got a consonant vowel card and were able to pronounce yin, yin. Then you see there are, in some places there are other spellings marked in the margin or in brackets after a word. Those are the effects of sound change cards played during that game. So, for instance, snisne became snisna, and sashimi became sashimi, gini, gini, and so forth. There are no affricates or diphthong cards in the deck, although you can form those using appropriate syllable cards that allow you to combine a plosive and a fricative or a vowel and approximant. The phoneme cards and syllable cards define the phonotactics of the language in terms of the segmental phonology, but at present the tone and stress is entirely left up to the player's discretion. I've thought about different ways of adding cards to the deck to specify the tone and stress rules, but I haven't yet come up with a good generalized way of doing that with card game mechanics. That's the basic outline of the way that the playtesting has gone so far and the overall structure of the game. I could go over the rules in a little bit more detail now, since I've got plenty of time left, but I'll probably finish early and allow us to get started with a couple of games. Probably one group of players at this end of the table and one group at that end of the table. I brought 2 decks, which is all I've got so far. In one of these decks, I've got an experimental set of syllable onset and rhyme cards. So one set of cards specifies the consonants or consonant clusters that can occur at the beginning of a syllable, and the other specifies the vowel and coda consonant or consonant cluster or none. We'll see how that works. One of the group of players will play that with those, and the other will play with the old syllable cards that we used in the first couple of playtesting games. The syntax cards are played down. There's 3 different groups of syntax cards, and I'm open to suggestions about making this more specific in different ways. But there's the main word order cards, like verb, subject, object, the modifier head and head modifier cards, which specify the relative order of, for instance, adjectives and adverbs, or relative to nouns and verbs. And then there's the prepositional and postpositional cards, which are constrained as to whether they can be played when certain main word order cards are in play or not. And when if for instance the verb subject object card is in play, and you have a subject object verb card in your hand, you could play that down and send the verb subject object card to the discard pile. And similarly with the other cards of the same types. There's a grammar change card that lets you play two of those at once. So you've got verb subject object, and you play down a secondary word order card along with a subject object verb card, and say subject object verb is used for subordinate clauses or questions or whatever you want to specify. Or you could play down a head modifier card in addition to the modifier head card and say, when you put the modifier after the head, you're emphasizing it. You're turning pretty into beautiful, for instance, or old into ancient, or whatever. There's a couple of rules for, additional rules for coining of words. If after a while or after a specified time limit, depending on the local rules of the game, you can't get the other players to understand what you mean by your word, you can use English as a last resort and then hold out your hand and let another player blindly draw a card and discard it. So reducing the size of your hand from then on. Or later on in the game, once we've got plenty of words available, if you're able to make the other players understand what you mean using the word in context or using other words to define it, then you get to draw an extra card at the end of your turn and increase the size of your hand. And there's a similar bonus for the player who first translates the group's challenge sentence, that they can add a card to their hand, increase their hand size, and give them more options about what to do in later rounds. An alternative form one might use when there's plenty of time available is, instead of the first player who translates their private sentence winning, is to simply play until you run out of time and the player who manages to translate the most sentences in the time available wins. So you play until someone translates their sentence, then they put that sentence aside face up and draw another one, or draw another subject and predicate, which they keep private until they translate it. And whoever translates the group's challenge sentence that's face up collects that, and then another one is drawn face up for the group to keep working on. So there's a lot more potential complexity to language that isn't, of course, encompassed in the rules of the game or the decks or the actual cards. And I'm not sure, I doubt it's possible to encompass the whole possible complexity of language in card game mechanics. So no matter how big the deck gets, there's always going to be some decisions that have to be left up to the players to either work out by example, influencing the other player's use of the language by your own use of the language, or by explicit discussion of how you want the language to work. What is exactly a subject or an object in this language? Are verbs a distinct part of speech from adjectives, or are adjectives just a type of intransitive verb? Does the language have articles? And if so, when and how are they mandatory? And do we have agreement between adjectives and nouns, or potentially even adverbs and verbs? So I'm going to stop talking now, and let's, those who want to play, let me know, and we'll get a group of players together at each end of the table. I've created a set of translation challenges that should be easier than the ones we used in the first couple of games. Although I made them up on the plane on the way out here, and I haven't tested them yet. But I tried to make them all roughly 4 or 5 words long, not counting articles and proper names. So and each one should have 1 or 2 abstract words and the rest concrete words. So they should be fairly evenly balanced, but we'll see.
Before we break, a few things. First off, anyone have questions? Raise your hand.
Yes.
Hi, did you consider the idea of maybe having some wild cards because I noticed that if I'm understanding your explanation of this game, the cards are dictating to you pretty much the way the language that results has to be formed. But especially if this is going to be played by conlangers bring to the game, heads filled with an understanding of rules and things like that. And it seems to me that there'd be room for a creative aspect by the players to input into the game themselves. So maybe a wild card that allows the particular player to make up something, a rule for the language right there on their own. Like, for example, suddenly throw it into, get wild and throw in noun incorporation, or let's go polysynthetic suddenly, and change the whole nature of the resulting language.
Yes, there's a couple of phoneme wildcards that let the player specify, who's putting the card down, specify what phoneme that wildcard represents. But there probably should be wildcard syllables and wildcard syntax cards and so forth. In fact, I might make up a few just in the next couple of minutes before I play with. Any other questions?